The evening was slipping into that soft, hazy glow of dusk, the kind that makes you feel like the world's holding its breath. I was in the laundry room of my Boone bungalow, folding a stack of worn dish towels, the dryer's hum a quiet companion. My hands moved on autopilot, smoothing creases, stacking each one with care, the way I'd done for years to keep some order in a life that hadn't always been kind. That's when my phone buzzed on the counter, cutting through the rhythm. Ethan's name glowed on the screen, and despite everything, despite the distance that had grown between us, I smiled. My boy, calling from Montreal. I picked up, cradling the phone against my shoulder. His voice came through warm, but distracted, saying he and Sophia were heading to some trendy bistro her cousin swore by. I asked about the trip, the chilly Montreal spring, if their hotel had a view. His answers were short-clipped, but I didn't mind. I was used to carrying the conversation, used to being the one who reached out across the miles. After a few minutes, he said he'd call again soon, and I told him I loved him, waiting for the familiar click of the line going dead. But it didn't come. Instead, there was a rustle, like the phone slipping into his jacket pocket. Then Sophia's voice, low and sharp, asking who he'd been talking to. Ethan's reply was casual, dismissive. Something about me, about the house, about a leaky faucet I'd mentioned last week. My heart stilled, but I kept folding, clutching a towel like an anchor. Then Sophia laughed, a sound that used to feel like family, but now turned my blood cold. She said the house was practically theirs already. Ethan's voice cut in sharp as a blade. I was a burden, someone they'd nudge into signing over the deed, with a few well-placed words about guilt. I froze, the warm light of the laundry room suddenly sterile. My house, the one I'd poured every spare dollar and sleepless night into, was just a stepping stone in their plan. A real estate flip, a quick profit. The towel slipped from my hands. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as their voices spilled on, plotting how to unravel the life I'd built. Grief, betrayal, clarity, they crashed over me like a wave, and in that moment I knew nothing would ever be the same. The day David died, the world didn't just stop, it shattered. I was 38, standing in our cramped Boone apartment, when the call came. A car accident, sudden and senseless, stole the man who'd made every room feel warmer just by walking in. Ethan was 14, all gangly limbs and quiet eyes, and I remember holding him that night, promising we'd be okay, even as my own heart felt like it was unraveling. The insurance payout came later, a cold stack of numbers that the agent called a benefit, as if money could replace David's laugh, or the way he'd hum off-key while fixing our leaky sink. I tucked it away untouched for nearly a year, too raw to think about what it meant. But life doesn't wait for grief to settle. Ethan needed stability, a future, and I needed something to pour myself into. I took on 2 jobs. Mornings at the local library, shelving books and helping kids find stories to escape into, and afternoons as a substitute teacher, grading papers late into the night. Boone's winters were harsh, and I'd trudge through snow to make sure Ethan had new boots, books for school, a chance at the life David and I had dreamed for him. I didn't date, didn't dream for myself. Mothering became my love story, the one thing I could control in a world that felt so fragile. When Ethan got into college, a good school in Raleigh with a partial scholarship, I sat in my car outside the library and cried. Not because it wasn't enough, but because it was proof he was reaching for something bigger. I sold my mother's old necklace, a delicate silver thing she'd love to cover the rest of his tuition. I picked up extra shifts, ignored the ache in my back, told him to focus on his studies. He'd hug me before leaving, promising he'd make me proud, and I believed him. Those promises felt like anchors, holding me steady through the long nights alone. I told myself it was enough. The sacrifices, the missed holidays, the quiet dinners, with just a plate for one, they were worth it for Ethan. I'd built a life around his future piece by piece, and every choice was a brick in that foundation. The house came later, but even then, it wasn't just for me. It was for us, for the boy I'd raised, and the man I hoped he'd become. I never imagined that same boy would one day stand in a Montreal cafe, calling me a burden, unraveling everything I'd held together for him. The Boone Bungalow was more than a house. It was my heart's answer to the emptiness David left behind. After a year of holding the insurance money like a fragile relic, I decided to use it to build something permanent, something ours. I found the place on a quiet street at the edge of town, a modest single story with weathered clapboard and a sagging front porch. It wasn't much to look at, not at first, but I saw its soul in the way the morning light spilled through the oak tree out front, casting shadows that danced like David's smile. I signed the papers in the spring of 2020, my hands trembling, knowing this was the first thing I'd ever owned entirely on my own. I poured myself into that house. Weekends were spent sanding floors, painting walls, a soft sage green coaxing life back into spaces that had been neglected. I'd haul secondhand furniture from flea markets, polishing tables until they gleamed, imagining Ethan sitting there one day safe and grounded. The porch became my favorite spot. I'd sit there after long shifts at the library, sipping tea, watching the Blue Ridge Mountains fade into dusk. It felt like David was there in the quiet approving of the life I was stitching together for our son. Every nail I hammered, every curtain I hung, was a promise to Ethan that we'd have a home no matter what we'd lost. The house wasn't just for me. It was for Ethan's future, a place he could always come back to. When he was home from college, I'd catch him sprawled on the couch, textbooks open, and I'd feel a quiet pride that I'd built this for him. I ignored the mortgage notices piling up the extra shifts I took to cover them. My back ached from carrying boxes, my hands roughened from gardening, but it was worth it. This was our foundation, a place where memories of David could live, and where Ethan could feel rooted no matter how far he roamed. I never thought that same house would become a battleground. As I stood in the laundry room, years later, clutching that towel, the memory of those early days stung sharper than the betrayal I just overheard. The sage walls, the porch swing, the oak tree. They weren't just mine anymore. Ethan and Sophia had started calling it our house, their voices creeping into spaces I'd built with my own hands. I'd made this home for love, for family, but now it felt like a stage for a plan I hadn't seen coming. When Ethan called to say he and Sophia were moving back to Boone, I felt a spark of hope I hadn't realized I'd been missing. It was early 2024, and he'd just graduated with a marketing degree, landing a remote job that sounded promising, but didn't quite cover the rent in Raleigh. Sophia, his girlfriend of 2 years, was starting a freelance graphic design gig, and they needed a place to land while they got on their feet. My bungalow, with its sage walls and open porch, felt like the perfect answer. I didn't hesitate. I told them to come home, cleared out the upstairs loft, and painted the spare room a soft beige Sophia said she liked. At first, it felt like a gift. The house, so quiet since Ethan left for college, hummed with life again. I'd hear Sophia's laughter from the kitchen, see Ethan's shoes by the door, and for a moment, it was like we were a family stitching itself back together. I cooked dinners, simple ones, like chili or roasted chicken. And we'd eat together, their stories of city life filling the gaps left by David's absence. I ignored the way Sophia rearranged my spice rack, or how Ethan started checking the mailbox before I could. They were settling in, I told myself, making the space their own. But there were moments that caught in my chest like a splinter. Sophia would mention redoing the porch, saying it could use a modern touch. Her voice bright but firm, as if she'd already decided. Ethan started handling the utility bills, insisting it was easier if he set up automatic payments. I nodded, grateful for the help, but I didn't ask why the electric company sent confirmations to his email instead of mine. The house, my house, started to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a shared project I hadn't signed up for. They'd call it our place in passing, and I'd smile, swallowing the unease, telling myself it was just words. I wanted to believe we were building something new together. After years of eating alone, of missing Ethan's voice in the halls, their presence felt like a second chance at family. But late at night, when the house was quiet, I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling of the room I'd built for us, wondering why their footsteps felt heavier than they should. I didn't see it then, but the ground was already shifting beneath me, grain by grain, in the home I'd poured my heart into. The shift in my Boone bungalow happened so quietly, I barely noticed it at first. It was like watching a river carve a new path through soft earth. Slow, steady, unstoppable. Ethan and Sophia had been back for 3 months when I started to feel like a guest in my own home. Sophia took to redecorating with a kind of cheerful confidence that left no room for discussion. One weekend, while I was covering an extra shift at the library, she painted the hallway a stark white, covering the sage green I'd chosen for its warmth. She said it looked cleaner, more modern, better for resale. Resale. The word landed like a stone in my chest, but I smiled, nodding as if I agreed. Ethan, meanwhile, took over the practical side of things. He insisted on managing the bills, setting up apps on his phone to track the utilities. I thought it was his way of helping a grown son, easing my load. But then I noticed the mail piling up in his name. Letters from the gas company, the water board, even a notice from the city addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Harper. I wasn't Mrs. Harper anymore, not since David and I hadn't been Harper Jr., ever. When I asked Ethan about it, he brushed it off, saying it was a clerical error, nothing to worry about. I wanted to believe him, so I let it go, ignoring the way my stomach twisted. They started calling it our house. More often, the phrase slipping into every conversation. We should replace the porch railing, Sophia would muse over breakfast, her tone suggesting it was already decided. Ethan would nod, adding that a new stove would increase the property's value. Value. Not home, not ours, in the way I'd meant when I bought it. I'd catch myself hesitating before touching my own walls, second-guessing whether I had a right to decide anything anymore. The oak tree out front, the one I'd sit under with my tea, started feeling like it belonged to someone else's story. I told myself it was temporary, that they were just finding their place. I'd spent years building this home for Ethan, for us, and I didn't want to be the kind of mother who clung too tightly. But at night, when their footsteps echoed through the loft and their laughter drifted down, I felt smaller, like the house was shrinking around me. My sanctuary, built with every late shift and sacrifice dream, was slipping through my fingers, and I hadn't even realized I was letting it go. The unease in my Boone bungalow grew like a shadow. You only notice when the light shifts. Ethan and Sophia had been back for nearly 6 months, and the little changes, white walls, redirected bills, started to pile up, each one a pinprick I tried to ignore. I'd catch Sophia rearranging my books on the living room shelf, stacking them by color instead of the worn, familiar order I loved. She'd say it looked better for guests, as if my home was a showroom. Ethan would chime in, suggesting we update the lighting to something sleeker, something that screamed investment potential. I'd nod my throat tight, telling myself they were just young, eager to make their mark. But there were moments that cut deeper. One evening, I came home from a long shift at the school, my shoulders aching from carrying a stack of graded papers, and found Sophia in the kitchen, tossing out my old ceramic mugs. They were chipped, she said, not worth keeping when they could buy something new. Those mugs were David's, the ones he'd sip coffee from on lazy Sunday mornings. But I didn't say that. I just fished them out of the trash later, hiding them in my closet like a secret. Ethan didn't notice, too busy scrolling through his phone, talking about property values in Boone. I wanted to ask why it mattered so much, but I didn't. I was afraid of the answer. I started to feel like I was fading in my own home. They'd planned dinners without asking if I was free, their voices filling the kitchen, while I stood at the counter, chopping onions for a meal I hadn't been invited to join. Ethan would brush past me, mentioning a new deck idea, as if my porch, the one I'd sit on dreaming of him as a boy, was already theirs to redesign. I'd tell myself it was my fault for not speaking up, for wanting so badly to keep the peace. I'd raised Ethan to feel safe here, hadn't I? Maybe I'd made it too easy for him to take it for granted. At night, I'd lie awake, tracing the cracks in my heart as they mirrored the ones in my home. The bungalow, my sanctuary, felt like it was slipping into someone else's story. I'd built it for Ethan, for us, but now every corner held their plans, their future, not mine. I kept smiling, kept folding laundry, kept pretending I didn't see the way they looked at my house, like it was a prize they were already claiming. But deep down, a quiet voice whispered that I was losing something I'd fought so hard to hold. The laundry room felt like a tomb as I stood there, phone in hand, the screen still glowing with Ethan's name. The call hadn't ended when I thought it had, and their voices, Ethan and Sophia's, had burned themselves into my mind. "She's a burden." Ethan had said, his tone so casual, it cut deeper than anger ever could. I should have hung up, walked away, let the moment pass. But something in me, some desperate need for clarity, made me press record and save the call before it vanished. Now alone in the quiet of my Boone bungalow, I sat on the edge of my bed, thumb hovering over the play button, knowing the truth would hurt, but needing to hear it again. I pressed play, and their voices filled the room, sharp and cold. Sophia's laugh came first light, but edged with something cruel, saying they'd guilt me into signing over the deed by reminding me of Ethan's college loans. Ethan's voice followed, calm and calculated, suggesting they play on my emotions, make me feel like they were my only family. My hand shook as I paused the recording, the words slicing through years of sacrifices. Late nights, grading papers, selling my mother's necklace, building this home for him. They wanted to flip the house, turn my sanctuary into a profit, and I was just a hurdle to clear. I hit play again, unable to stop. Sophia mentioned taking my bedroom, the one with David's old dresser, because it made no sense for me to have it when I was barely contributing. Ethan agreed, saying I'd give in if they framed it as my duty. Each word was a brick walling me out of the life I'd built. I paused again, closing my eyes, the silence heavier than their voices. The bungalow's walls, once my refuge, seemed to echo their plan, every sage-green corner mocking the love I'd poured into it. I saved the recording, my fingers numb, and set the phone down. The truth wasn't just their words. It was the realization that I'd been shrinking myself to fit their vision. I'd ignored the white walls, the redirected bills, the way they called it, our house, because I wanted to believe in Ethan, in the boy I'd raised. But this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a betrayal, deliberate and cold, and it broke something in me I didn't know could still break. As I sat there, the deed to the bungalow locked in the safe under my bed, a quiet resolve began to form, like a spark in the dark, whispering that I wasn't done fighting for myself. The recording sat silent on my phone, but its echoes stirred memories that rolled in like a bitter tide. Sitting on my bed in the Boone bungalow, the weight of Ethan's words, "She's a burden," pressed against every sacrifice I'd made for him. I thought of the winter I worked double shifts at the library and school, my breath fogging in the cold, as I walked home to save gas money for his school supplies. I saw myself at 38 signing the insurance papers after David's accident, my hands steady for Ethan's sake, even as my heart broke. Every choice I'd made was for him, to give him a life where he could dream without fear. I remembered selling my mother's silver necklace, the one she'd worn every Sunday, to cover his college tuition when the scholarship fell short. I'd stood in the pawn shop, clutching the chain, telling myself it was just metal, that Ethan's future was worth more. I thought of the holidays I missed serving coffee at the school's staff room while others celebrated so I could afford his textbooks. My back ached from years of carrying that load, but I told myself it was enough to see him smile, to hear him promise he'd make me proud. Those promises felt like ash, now scattered by the truth of his words. The bungalow itself was a monument to my love. I'd chosen it for its porch, imagining Ethan coming home to it safe-rooted. I'd sanded floors until my hands blistered painted walls, until midnight made it a home where David's memory could linger. Every nail, every curtain was a piece of me given freely for my son. But now, as I sat in the room, I'd built those memories turned sharp. Ethan's voice, plotting to take this house, made every sacrifice feel like a debt he'd never repay. I'd given him everything, my youth, my dreams, my heart, and still he saw me as a burden to maneuver. I pressed my hands to my face, trying to hold back the grief. But it wasn't just sadness. It was the sting of realizing I'd let myself disappear into his needs. The boy I'd raised, who'd once run to me with scraped knees, was now a man who calculated my worth like a line item in a budget. The bungalow, my sanctuary, felt like a trap, closing around me its walls, whispering back the years I'd spent believing love could be enough. As I looked at the safe where the deed lay, a flicker of something new stirred. Not anger, not yet, but a quiet refusal to let my sacrifices be erased. The silence in my Boone bungalow was deafening after the recording stopped. I sat on the edge of my bed, the phone cold in my hand, Ethan and Sophia's voices still ringing in my ears. They'd called me a burden, plotted to guilt me into giving up my home, and every word felt like a knife twisting through the years I'd spent building a life for us. I wanted to scream, to call Ethan and demand an explanation, but my voice felt trapped, tangled in a knot of hurt and disbelief. How could the boy I'd raised, the one I'd given everything for, see me as something to manipulate? I walked to the kitchen, my bare feet heavy on the hardwood I'd sanded myself. The sage walls, the ones Sophia had painted over in places, seemed to mock me, reflecting a truth I'd been too afraid to face. I'd let them take pieces of this house, my sanctuary, because I thought it would keep us close. I'd ignored the way they claimed the space, their casual mentions of resale value, their assumption that my life was theirs to reshape. But hearing them plan to edge me out, to use my love as a weapon, cracked something open inside me. It wasn't just betrayal. It was the realization that I'd been complicit, shrinking myself to fit their needs. I stood at the counter staring at the chipped ceramic mug I'd rescued from Sophia's discard pile. David's mug, the one he'd held during our quiet mornings together. I'd fought so hard to keep this home, to keep Ethan safe, but now it felt like I was fighting to hold on to myself. The grief wasn't just for what they'd done. It was for the version of Ethan I'd believed in, the son who'd once written me letters from college promising to make me proud. That boy was gone, replaced by a man who saw my sacrifices as leverage. I opened the safe under my bed, pulling out the deed to the bungalow. Its weight in my hands felt like a lifeline, a reminder that this was still mine, paid for, with my sweat and sleepless nights. I wasn't ready to let go. Not of the house, not of myself. The betrayal stung, but beneath it a quiet strength was stirring, like a seed breaking through soil. I didn't know what came next, but I knew I couldn't stay here, playing the role they'd written for me. As I tucked the deed back into the safe, I felt the first stirrings of resolve, a promise to myself that I wouldn't let their words define my worth. The morning after I heard Ethan and Sophia's betrayal, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The Boone bungalow, once my sanctuary, now felt like a cage, its walls holding the echo of their words. She's a burden. I couldn't stay here, letting their plan tighten around me like a noose. I needed to know where I stood, what was still mine. By 8, I was driving to Rachel's law office, the deed to the bungalow tucked in my bag, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and resolve. Rachel had been there through it all, David's funeral, Ethan's high school graduation, and I trusted her to see me, not just the mother I'd become. Her office smelled of coffee and old books, a familiar comfort as I slid the deed across her desk. I didn't need to say much. Rachel's sharp eyes caught the weight in mine. She scanned the document, her fingers tracing the lines I'd signed years ago, and confirmed what I needed to hear. The house was mine, solely, no cosigners, no liens, no strings attached. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. I told her just enough about the recording Ethan and Sophia's plan to guilt me out of my home, their casual cruelty. Her face stayed steady, but her pen moved quickly, jotting notes as I spoke, her silence a kind of strength I leaned into. We spent the next hour mapping out my options. Rachel outlined legal protections, ways to secure my ownership, steps to take if Ethan and Sophia pushed back. Her voice was calm, but her eyes held the same fire I felt growing inside me. I didn't cry or raise my voice. I signed papers, made copies, and tucked the deed back into my bag. As I left, I felt the first real breath I'd taken in days, like I was reclaiming something I'd almost lost. The bungalow was still mine, but I knew staying there wasn't an option. Their voices had tainted every corner, and I wouldn't live in a home where my worth was measured in guilt. Driving back, I passed the oak tree in my front yard, its branches heavy with spring leaves. I'd built that house for Ethan, for us, but now it was a weight I couldn't carry anymore. Rachel's words echoed. "You're in control, Elise." I held on to that, letting it anchor me as I began to imagine a life beyond these walls. The betrayal had broken something, but it had also woken me up. I wasn't just a mother or a widow. I was a woman who deserved to choose her own path, and I was ready to start walking it. The clarity I'd found with Rachel carried me like a current, pulling me toward a decision I hadn't dared to name until now. I couldn't stay in the Boone bungalow, not with Ethan and Sophia's voices echoing in every room, their betrayal staining the walls I'd painted with love. By noon, I was on the phone with Daniel, a realtor I'd met years ago through a library fundraiser. He was discreet, no nonsense, the kind of man who didn't ask questions unless they mattered. When I told him I needed to sell the house quietly and quickly, he didn't hesitate, suggesting we meet the next day at a coffee shop 2 towns over, away from prying eyes. Sitting across from Daniel in that small cafe, I felt the weight of the deed in my bag, a tether to the life I'd built. He sipped his black coffee, flipping through photos of the bungalow I'd emailed him. Sage walls, the porch, the oak tree. He said the market was hot, that he knew buyers who'd jump at a place like mine, especially priced to move. I nodded, my hand steady, but inside my heart churned. This wasn't just a house. It was years of late nights, sacrificed dreams, David's memory woven into every corner. But it was also a trap, a place where I'd let myself shrink to fit Ethan's plans. Selling it was my way of breaking free. Daniel outlined the process: a private listing, a quick closing, no open houses. I told him I wanted it done before Ethan and Sophia returned from Montreal, which gave us a narrow window. He didn't flinch, just jotted notes and promised to handle the details. As I left the cafe, the spring air felt sharper, like it was waking me up. I wasn't just selling a house. I was reclaiming myself, refusing to let their betrayal define what I deserved. The bungalow had been my sanctuary, but I couldn't live in a place where my love was used against me. Back home, I stood on the porch, the one I dreamed of sharing with Ethan, and looked out at the Blue Ridge Mountains. The view was still beautiful, but it didn't belong to me anymore. I thought of David, of the life we'd planned, and realized he'd want me to choose myself now. The decision to sell wasn't just about leaving. It was about honoring the woman who'd carried this family alone for so long. As I turned back inside, the deed still safe in my bag, I felt a quiet strength settle in, like a fire that had been smoldering, ready to burn bright. The decision to sell the Boone bungalow lit a fire in me, and I moved with a purpose I hadn't felt in years. Over the next 2 days, I became a quiet storm, sorting through the life I'd built in this house. I started in my bedroom, pulling out the things that were truly mine. Photos of David and Ethan from happier days, the quilt my mother made, the worn leather chair David used to read in. Each item was a piece of me, not the mother they'd reduced to a burden, but the woman who'd carried this family through grief. I packed them carefully, my hand steady as if sealing away a chapter I wasn't ready to forget. Ethan and Sophia's belongings were another matter. I moved through the loft with precision, cataloging their clothes books and sleek gadgets they'd scattered across my home. I didn't touch their things with anger, though the sting of their words, "she's a burden," hovered like a shadow. Instead, I boxed them neatly, labeling each one with their names in sharp black marker. I rented a moving truck and arranged a storage unit in town, prepaying for 6 months. The code for the unit went into an envelope for Rachel, who'd pass it to them if they came looking. I didn't owe them explanations, but I wouldn't let them call me cruel. The house felt lighter as I worked, like it was exhaling years of weight. I walked through each room, touching the sage walls I'd painted, the windows David's memory had once framed. I didn't linger on sadness. I was too focused, too determined. The bungalow had been my sanctuary, but it was also a tether to a version of myself I'd outgrown. One who'd given too much, expecting love in return. Packing wasn't just about leaving. It was about choosing what to carry forward and what to let go. By the second night, the house was nearly empty of me. My boxes were loaded into the truck, ready for a furnished rental I'd found in Harrisonburg, a place with bare walls and no memories. I stood in the kitchen, the last of my things packed, and felt a strange peace. The betrayal had broken me open, but it had also shown me my own strength. I wasn't running. I was walking away deliberate and free. As I taped the final box, I thought of Ethan, of the boy he'd been, and realized I wasn't packing away my love for him. I was packing away the illusion that I needed his approval to be whole. My last night in the Boone bungalow was quiet, but not the aching kind I'd grown used to. The house was stripped of my presence. My photos, David's chair, the quilt, all packed into the truck, waiting outside. I stood in the kitchen, the heart of the home I'd built, and felt a stillness settle over me. Ethan and Sophia were still in Montreal, oblivious to the storm I'd set in motion. The sale was finalized, the keys ready to pass to a new owner, and I was ready to walk away. But first, I had one last thing to leave behind. A note, not out of spite, but to claim the truth they'd tried to bury. I sat at the counter, pen in hand, and wrote on a single sheet of paper, "Surprise." A burden did this. The words were sharp, deliberate, a mirror to their cruelty. I didn't explain the sale, didn't justify myself. They'd hear their own voices soon enough, the recording I'd saved waiting to speak for me. I placed the note where they'd see it, right beside the keys I'd leave on the counter. The keys felt heavy, not with regret, but with the weight of everything I'd poured into this place. Every late shift, every dream deferred, every hope I'd pinned on Ethan. Letting them go was like exhaling a breath I'd held too long. I walked through the house one last time, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood. The sage walls, the porch, the oak tree outside, they weren't mine anymore, but they'd never belonged to Ethan and Sophia either. They'd seen this place as a prize, a stepping stone for their ambitions, while I'd seen it as a home. As I locked the back door and stepped into the garage, I thought of David, of the life we'd planned here. He'd have wanted me to choose myself, to walk away from a place that no longer held love. I didn't look back as the garage door closed behind me, the sound final like a book snapping shut. Driving away, the Blue Ridge Mountains, blurred in the rear view, their familiar peaks softening into the dusk. I wasn't running from Ethan or Sophia. I was moving toward something new, a life where I defined my own worth. The note wasn't for them, not really. It was for me, a declaration that I'd seen their truth and chosen mine. As the road stretched toward Harrisonburg, I felt the weight of the bungalow lift, replaced by a quiet freedom I hadn't known I could claim. For the first time in years, I was leaving behind more than a house. I was leaving behind the version of myself that had believed love had to hurt. The cafe on Main Street buzzed with morning chatter, but I felt a strange calm as I walked in 5 minutes late, my phone heavy in my pocket. Ethan and Sophia had demanded this meeting, their messages sharp with panic, after finding my note in the locked bungalow. They sat at a corner table, their untouched coffee mugs betraying their tension. I didn't smile or greet them. I just sat, set my phone on the table screen, up and pressed play. Their voices spilled out. Ethan's cold calculation, Sophia's biting laugh, calling me a burden, plotting to guilt me out of my home. The words filled the space between us, raw and undeniable. I watched their faces shift. Sophia's eyes widened, her hands tightening around her mug, while Ethan's jaw clenched, his gaze darting away. He tried to interrupt, saying I'd misunderstood, but I held up a hand, letting the recording finish. Sophia leaned forward, her voice low and sharp, accusing me of blindsiding them, selling their home out from under them. I met her eyes and said it was never theirs. The bungalow was mine, paid for with my sweat, my sacrifices, my love. Ethan scoffed, claiming I'd betrayed him after all they'd done. I looked at him, the boy I'd raised, and said he'd taught me what not to become. The air grew heavy, their indignation crumbling under the weight of their own words. I didn't raise my voice or let tears fall. I told them there'd be no money, no access to my accounts, no forwarding address. Sophia opened her mouth, then closed it, her confidence faltering. Ethan's hands balled into fists, his voice tight as he reminded me he was my son, as if that alone should bend me. I looked at him steady and said, I'd been his mother, not his asset. The truth hung there sharp and final, and for the first time, I saw them falter in the silence they'd never learned to carry. I slid an envelope across the table, containing the storage unit details for their belongings, and stood to leave. Neither called after me as I walked out, the cafe's noise fading behind me. The confrontation wasn't about revenge. It was about drawing a line, claiming the space I'd almost lost. I'd spent years giving Ethan everything, believing love meant sacrifice. But in that moment, I understood love also meant protecting myself. As I stepped into the spring sunlight, the weight of their betrayal didn't follow me. I'd face them not with anger, but with the clarity of a woman who finally knew her worth. The drive to Harrisonburg felt like crossing a threshold, the Blue Ridge Mountains fading in my rear view as I left Boone behind. My new home was a furnished rental, a small apartment with light wood floors and bare walls that held no echoes of the past. I unpacked slowly, placing David's chair by the window, hanging my mother's quilt over the couch. Each item settled into the space like a quiet promise. This was mine, a life I was choosing, not one shaped by someone else's needs. For the first time in years, I felt the freedom of a blank page, daunting, but full of possibility. I didn't hear from Ethan or Sophia after the cafe confrontation, though their frantic voicemails lingered on my phone unanswered. I let the silence speak for me, a boundary I'd never known how to set before. Mornings became my own. I'd make tea, real tea, not the half-cold cups I used to forget in Boone. I'd sit by the window, watching the world wake up, the birds on the ledge, moving without expectation. The quiet wasn't lonely. It was whole, a space where I could breathe without waiting for someone to need me. Harrisonburg unfolded gently around me. I found a rhythm in small things. Walking to the local market, reading novels I'd shelved for years, letting entire afternoons pass without a schedule. The apartment's neutrality was a gift, its walls unburdened by memories of betrayal. I started to notice myself again, the woman I'd been before I became Ethan's mother, David's widow. I'd spent so long giving, I'd forgotten what it felt like to simply be. Now I was learning, slowly, deliberately, who Elise was when no one was asking for pieces of her. I donated a portion of the bungalow's sale to a local charity. For single mothers, a quiet nod to the woman I'd been scraping by for Ethan. It wasn't about erasing the past, but balancing it, giving back without losing myself. The rest of the money went into a savings account, a safety net I'd never had. I didn't need to fill the silence with plans or people. I was enough, and that realization settled in like sunlight through my new windows. As I arranged a photo of David and young Ethan on the shelf, I felt a peace I hadn't known I could claim. A life built on my terms, not defined by the son who'd called me a burden or the home I'd left behind. The quiet of my new life in Harrisonburg wasn't empty. It was a canvas, waiting for me to choose what to paint. A few weeks after settling into my apartment, I stumbled across a flyer at the local market for a community center hosting grief and boundary setting groups. Something about it tugged at me, a whisper of the woman I was rediscovering. I showed up to a session, nervous, sitting in a circle of strangers, saying my name aloud, like I was introducing myself for the first time. It felt raw, but right, like stepping into a room I'd forgotten I belonged in. The group wasn't about fixing each other. It was about listening. Women shared stories of loss, of giving too much, of learning to say no. I didn't talk about Ethan, not directly. Instead, I spoke of the quiet ways we lose ourselves when we live for others, how I'd let my Boone bungalow become a stage for someone else's plans. The words came slowly, but they carried a truth I hadn't voiced before. I wasn't alone, and that realization began to stitch together the pieces of me I'd thought were gone. One evening, a woman named Amara, who ran a shelter for single mothers on the edge of town, pulled me aside. Her eyes were warm but steady, like she saw something in me I was only beginning to recognize. She said the shelter could use someone like me, not to preach, but to sit with the women, to listen to, share what I'd learned about holding on to yourself. I started going once a week, then twice, sitting on worn couches with mothers who carried the same weight I'd known. Years of giving, of being needed, but not seen. I didn't tell them what to do. I shared my story, the parts that mattered, and listened as they found their own strength, helping them help me. I wasn't saving anyone, but I was there present, offering the kind of quiet support I'd craved when I was scraping by for Ethan. Amara became a friend, her laughter filling the shelter's small kitchen as we made coffee for the group. Through those afternoons, I found a purpose I hadn't sought, a way to give without losing myself. The betrayal that had driven me from Boone didn't vanish, but it faded like a bruise healing under careful hands. I was no longer just Ethan's mother or David's widow. I was Elise, building a life that felt like mine, rooted in a community that saw me for who I was, not what I could give. The Harrisonburg air carried a crisp edge as fall settled in, and I found myself walking home from the community center, my steps lighter than they'd been in years. I hadn't thought of Ethan in days, not with the sharp ache of betrayal or the anger that once burned through me. Instead, there was a quiet distance like a river that had carved a new path, leaving the old one behind. I'd spent so long holding on to the boy I'd raised, the one who'd promised to make me proud, but I was beginning to see that letting go didn't mean losing him. It meant releasing the illusion I'd clung to. I sat at my kitchen table one evening, a mug of tea warming my hands, and opened my journal. The pages were filled with moments I'd carried. David's laughter, Ethan's childhood, the Boone bungalow's sage walls. But now, I wrote for myself. I wasn't a burden. I wrote the words steady and sure. I was the foundation, the one who'd held it all together when grief tried to pull us apart. I'd given more than anyone could ask, and when Ethan and Sophia tried to reduce me to what I could offer, I'd chosen to walk away. That choice wasn't cruelty. It was clarity, a refusal to let their vision of me erase the woman I was. I thought of the bungalow, now someone else's home, its porch likely painted a new color. I'd driven by my old street once, not out of longing, but to see it from the outside. The oak tree stood tall, the windows gleamed, and it didn't hurt the way I'd feared. It was just a house now, not the anchor I'd made it. Letting go of it had freed me to see Ethan for who he'd become. Not the boy who jumped into leaf piles, but a man who'd chosen his own path. One that didn't include me. That truth settled in without bitterness. A quiet acceptance that some losses are steps toward something truer. In Harrisonburg, I was building a life that belonged to me. The community center, Amara's shelter, the women who shared their stories. They reminded me that I wasn't alone. I didn't need Ethan's approval to be whole, just as I didn't need the bungalow to feel rooted. As I closed my journal, the apartment's quiet wrapped around me, soft and full, like a home I'd made without sacrificing myself. I was letting go, not of love, but of the weight I'd carried for too long. For the first time, I felt light like a woman who'd finally found her own way home. A year has passed since I left the Boone bungalow, and the quiet of my Harrisonburg apartment feels like a gift I didn't know I deserved. Sitting by my window, watching the first autumn leaves fall, I realize I've become someone new. Not just Ethan's mother or David's widow, but Elise, a woman who chose herself when the world tried to tell her she was less. The betrayal that broke me open also set me free, and in that freedom, I found a truth worth sharing. Our worth isn't tied to what we give others. It's in the boundaries we set, the lives we build, the courage to walk away when love becomes a weight. I think of the women at Amara's shelter, their stories echoing my own. Years of giving, of being needed but not seen. I didn't find my strength alone. I found it in their voices, in the community we built by listening. That's what I want for you watching this now. Take a moment to ask yourself, where have you given too much? Where have you let someone else's needs define you? Maybe it's a home, a relationship, a dream you've shelved to keep others happy. You don't have to stay there. You can choose yourself not out of selfishness, but out of clarity, just as I did when I left that note and walked away. Your story matters. Maybe you faced betrayal like I did, or maybe you're learning to say no for the first time. Share it below this video in a journal with someone you trust. Let it remind you that you're not a burden, but a foundation strong enough to build a life that's yours. If my journey resonates, hit that subscribe button and join this community. We're here to share stories of reclaiming our space, of finding peace in the quiet moments of knowing our worth doesn't depend on anyone else's approval. As I sip my tea, the Harrisonburg sunset painting the sky, I'm grateful for this new chapter. It's not perfect, but it's mine. You deserve that too. A life where you're seen not for what you give, but for who you are. So take that first step. Set a boundary. Write your truth, and if you're ready, share it with us in the comments. Let's lift each other up one story at a time, because none of us are alone in this journey to find our way home.